I'll move floor amendment number 7 to CS Committee Substitute R41. This, councilors, provides an additional $100,000 to the fire department for backfill pay. Funds would be used to pay for firefighters to cover shifts for other firefighters who are attending promotional training while on duty. And the funding for the backfill pay and the reserve will come from the $3 million reserve for future projects.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. There's a motion and a second for floor amendment number 7. Councilors, any discussion? Councilor Sanchez.
Thank you, Madam President. I have a question regarding number 3. The use of these funds is subject to collective bargaining.
And I'll defer to staff on that. They suggested that that was necessary.
Good evening, Mr. Thompson.
Madam President, councilors, that language was included at my recommendation. There are provisions in the current bargaining agreement that require that certain training monies and certain other expenses be subject to collective bargaining. Having talked to the union, even if there is nothing now in the union contract, I think everyone agrees that putting these funds up there so that people can be available to attend training is a mandatory topic of bargaining, so that's something that has to be decided at the bargaining table. And finally, there's a question. The contract is somewhat ambiguous with respect to what is specifically in that contract. And there are some arguments that within that contract right now there is an obligation to make these payments. If that language is already in the contract, then it doesn't hurt to say it's going to be subject to bargaining. If that language is not in the contract, then it should be something that is decided at the bargaining table.
Councilor Sanchez.
Mr. Thompson, so you're saying that it is not in the contract currently?
There are, I was just going over this with the union president, there are about 3 or 4 different sections within the current contract that deal with the obligation of whether or not, the obligation to provide training in various situations, whether or not training is required or whether it's optional with respect to this particular type of situation where you are doing training for an optional promotion, whether or not that's something that is required for employees to attend. There's some debate about what that means. This just makes it real clear if these kind of benefits are going to be provided to union employees that it should be something at some point that is going to be subject to mandatory bargaining. It may already be decided. That's something for the negotiators and for the administration with the union to decide, possibly for the labor board to decide. But if it's not in there and there's some question about whether it is in there, then it needs to go to bargaining.
I never realized that training was a benefit. I thought it was part of their job.
Madam President, Councilor Sanchez, this is training when an employee wants to get a promotion or an additional benefit. So in that situation where it's optional to the employee as far as whether or not they want to participate in that training, it may or may not be a benefit. I think it can be seen that way, but even if it's part of something that is required of the job, that's something that should come from the bargaining table.
But don't they need the training to become a driver?
Madam President, Councilor Sanchez, there's a lot of different training that is required of these firefighters, and how that is provided and what the obligation of the city is to provide that, I believe, is a mandatory topic of bargaining.
If I may, before we move on, because it's fascinating, does this mean that if we were to appropriate $100,000 or $8,000 or any amount of money, that we cannot specify and make it hold that it goes for a specific use unless that is also negotiated in collective bargaining?
Madam President, Councilors, this is very similar to what we just had with respect to the transit drivers. The city can make the funds available and say their intent is to look at using that $1 per hour per transit driver for salary increases. But unless that matter is negotiated at the bargaining table, the city cannot impose those funds and cannot give that benefit to those drivers. I think similarly here, if the city is going to make this a benefit or make this something that is added into the package that the employees receive, that's something that even if you put the money out there, I don't believe it can be expended until it is negotiated between the parties, if it's not already in that contract, and there's some debate about that.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Harris, Councilor Harris.
Thank you. I guess I'd like to hear from the chief as well as see Mr. Eric Kahn here regarding whether or not, I think I'm most concerned about whether or not our firefighters are getting trained, and if they have these rights to training. I guess Mr. Aaron Kahn is probably going to tell us why he thinks it's necessary, but I would like to get the two different perspectives. Chief, do you think we need this, or Mr.
Madam
Perry?
President, Councilor Hudson, I think the chief needs to address this. I just want to point out that this is the subject of a prohibited practice complaint right now that Mr. Thompson has already pointed out, but I think it's important to emphasize and explain to you what that means. There is a debate right now where the collective bargaining unit, IAAF, is saying that this is currently in the existing contract, that there's a requirement that the city pay for this professional development training. And the city has taken the position that, yes, the training that's required is the training that is related to your particular position, and there's minimum standards for that, and we do provide that to you while you're on duty. But by appropriating this amount of money, I would respectfully submit it would probably compromise the city's position on the PPC because it's not funded now. With that, I'll turn it over to Chief to explain to you the distinctions and nuances between the training that's provided and the training that's sought within this amendment. Thank you, sir.
I notice the clock doesn't work when I'm up here.
Chief Breen, I think you're the only person who welcomes that clock to work.
Please. The fire department is engaged in dozens of training programs, and each training program has even more individual training classes that are a part of that particular program. That said, non-hazardous, when I took over as chief, there was no professional development training that was ongoing within the department except for apparatus or driver training. Other than that, there was no professional qualifications for Fire Officer 1, 2, Incident Safety Officer. The standard things that you would expect from a professional fire department were not in place. So this is something that we developed. We linked we linked professional development programs to promotional eligibility. After all, we hire firefighters. We don't hire drivers, lieutenants, captains, or commanders. Those people make themselves eligible by possessing the necessary skills so that they can operate efficiently and safely on high-risk incidents. And so in order to accomplish that, we instituted a professional development training program that was linked to promotional eligibility. Any type of hazardous training due to risk management and workers' compensation type issues, they attend that training in a paid, a work status, a paid status. But all department mandated training as well is actually in a paid status. So if we require that for the positions that they currently hold, they get paid to do that. And they get compensated for their time. However, if they want to acquire the necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities or the professional qualifications to make themselves eligible for promotion, they have to get that on their own. We do provide that in-house training with our own instructors, but it's also available online through CNM, nationally online, or through the State Fire Academy. So there's a lot of different venues for the different learning styles for our firefighters. But I do want to make it clear, when they attend classroom-type sessions for professional development, that's in a non-paid status. However, again, if there's any hazardous portions of training on the drill field, manipulative skills, driving apparatus, that is all in a paid status.
Thank you, Chief. Councilor Garduno.
Is this particular to firefighters? Does anybody get paid? Any other department, division, folks who work for the police, for instance? Do you know if they get paid?
I'm not sure what their promotional eligibility requirements are, but here's a good example of this, if I may. If I was a paralegal, I wouldn't expect my employer to pay for me to go to law school, correct? And this is the same kind of deal. This is strictly for promotional eligibility purposes. And this is a trend that is standard throughout the American Fire Service. This isn't something unique to Albuquerque. This is how everyone else does it.
So you don't know if the police department does this?
I could ask Chief Schiltz to speak. Sir?
Chief?
Sorry.
How to shoot.
Madam President, Councilor Gardino, we do not have training that is specific for eligibility to promotion. So we do not.
How do you promote folks?
Madam Chairman, Councilor Gardino, the officers, based on time and seniority within the organization, sign up through city HR, and they are given a test. They start off with a written test. People who pass the written test and move on to an assessment center process.
So there's no certification necessarily?
Madam President, Councilor Gardino, there is no